The boarding school matron. The sanatorium at Haverstock Ladies College was supposed to be completely deserted during the October half-term. Its 30 iron cots stripped of their linen, its medicine presses locked, its tall, mullioned windows looking out upon empty Cotswold parkland, where 300 schoolgirls had departed 4 days earlier. But on a freezing Thursday night, in a third-floor sick bay, where no living soul had permission to draw breath, the strict school matron sat upright in an armchair beside an extinguished hearth, her cold hands folded neatly over a blue exercise book, dead of a massive dose of medicinal veronal. Beside her, on the washstand, rested 2 bone china teacups, one drained to the dregs, the other untouched, and beneath her slippered foot lay a single sheet of school foolscap covered in 200 identical lines of punishment writing, every single one penned in the unmistakable, rebellious hand of a girl who had officially boarded the London Express on Monday morning and was supposed to be 60 miles away. Hello, and welcome to Midnight Pages. I'm David, your host, joining you once again from Ohio. Tonight's story takes us behind the ivy-covered stone walls of an exclusive English boarding school during the dead stillness of a mid-autumn holiday, a time when empty corridors echo with strange footsteps and institutional routine gives way to a desperate, hidden struggle. It is a mystery that revolves around the terrible vulnerability of a young person, trapped by an unscrupulous guardian, a strict woman who discovered a dangerous truth in the dark, and a set of ordinary school punishment lines that held a desperate cry for help, disguised as mechanical obedience. Before we step into the silent quadrangles of Haverstock, let me ask you, have you ever known someone who was forced to make themselves entirely invisible, hiding in plain sight because the people sworn to protect them were the very ones they had to fear? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and tonight's case offers a profound meditation on the courage of the overlooked. Now the wind is rustling through the Cotswold beech trees, and the sanatorium lamp is lit. Let us step inside together. Chapter 1. The Sanatorium in Half-Term. Haverstock Ladies College occupied an imposing Elizabethan manor house of honey-colored honeystone, situated 3 miles outside the ancient market town of Chipping Campden. Surrounded by 200 acres of sloping parkland, ancient yew hedges clipped into severe geometric battlements, and a sluggish brown stream known locally as the Churn, the school possessed an atmosphere of austere, aristocratic seclusion. For 60 years, the daughters of bishops, admirals, colonial administrators, and prosperous country squires had been sent to Haverstock to be instructed in deportment, French irregular verbs, botany, and the precise degree of moral fortitude required to manage an English country house. During term time, the school was a hive of regulated noise. The ringing of chapel bells at 7 in the morning, the clatter of 300 pairs of stout brogues upon stone flags, the distant shrieks from the hockey pitches, and the ceaseless murmur of the school orchestra practicing Handel in the great hall. The architecture of Haverstock reflected the stern, uncompromising piety of its Victorian founders. Built upon the foundations of an ancient Cistercian grange that had fallen into ruin during the dissolution of the monasteries, the manor possessed soaring chimneys of carved ashlar, deep oriel windows flanked by stone gargoyles depicting medieval virtues and vices, and long vaulted corridors paved with fossil-bearing limestone that remained icy to the touch even in the height of July. In the great hall, beneath an open timbered hammer-beam roof of blackened Sussex oak, hung portraits of 6 successive headmistresses, severe, high-collared ladies whose painted eyes followed every generation of pupils with an expression of vigilant, unyielding admonition. It was an institution where decorum was elevated to a theological principle, and where a dropped glove or an unknotted hair ribbon was regarded as the first step toward moral degeneracy. During half-term week in late October, however, Haverstock underwent a transformation so profound that it seemed to belong to an entirely different century. The pupils had all departed on Monday morning by chartered motor coaches for the railway junction at Moreton-in-Marsh, bound for their homes in London, Surrey, and the Shires. The domestic staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew of 3 daily cleaners and the elderly boilerman. The teaching mistresses had scattered to visit relatives or take the waters at Cheltenham, and the vast, high-ceilinged building stood empty, cold, and echoing, wrapped in the thick autumn mists that rolled down from the Cotswold escarpment. Miss Hartley's journey from Hampshire to Gloucestershire on Tuesday had been a pleasant, unhurried progression through an English landscape dressed in the full splendor of late autumn. The branch-line train had wound its way through the golden beech woods of the Stroud Valley, past stone villages tucked into the folds of the hills, where the smoke from wood fires hung low in the valley mist, before depositing her upon the quiet platform at Moreton-in-Marsh. There, Dorothy Pierce had met her with a modest Morris Oxford, and they had driven through lanes banked high with yellow bracken and wild spindleberry to the gates of Haverstock. To Miss Hartley, whose keen eyes observed everything and forgot nothing, the school presented a curious study in institutional psychology. Behind the imposing wrought-iron gates, bearing the school's Latin motto, "Our Lady, in Thee we have hoped," the gravel driveway wound between ancient lime trees whose fallen leaves formed a golden carpet, undisturbed by a single footstep. The great house, with its 40 chimney stacks, its leaded casements reflecting the pale October sky, and its vast stone stable block, now converted into science laboratories and gymnasiums, seemed to hold its breath in the absence of the children. It was like an immense stage when the actors have departed, and only the scenery remains vast, silent, and subtly melancholy. Miss Hartley had come in response to a warm invitation from Miss Dorothy Pierce. Dorothy, a sensible, pleasant woman of 40, with an honors degree in modern history from Somerville College, served as a junior housemistress at Haverstock, and was the dearest school friend of Miss Hartley's favorite niece, Joan. Having recently suffered a severe bout of pleurisy, Miss Pierce had been ordered by her physician to rest during the vacation, and she had eagerly welcomed Miss Hartley's company for a quiet week of needlework, fireside conversation, and gentle strolls through the orchard. "You will find it utterly tranquil, Miss Hartley," Dorothy Pierce had remarked on Wednesday evening, as they shared a pot of hot chocolate in her cozy sitting room in the West Wing. "Except for Miss Harbottle, the headmistress, who remains in the schoolhouse dealing with the governor's correspondence, and Matron Rook over in the sanatorium, there is scarcely a living creature in the entire building. One can hear a leaf scraping across the flagstones in the quadrangle from 300 yards away." "Quiet places, my dear Dorothy," Miss Hartley had observed mildly, her knitting needles moving with their accustomed rhythm, "are so very often the places where human thoughts become most active. In St. Mary Mead, whenever our dear vicar goes away for his annual fortnight at the seaside, the parish appears on the surface to be utterly dormant, and yet that is invariably the week when old Mrs. Bantry's cook decides to give notice, or Mr. Simpkins at the draper's discovers a deficit in the petty cash. When the ordinary bustle of life stops, the things that have been growing in the dark have a curious way of coming to the surface." The truth of that gentle observation was demonstrated with terrifying suddenness on Friday morning at 7:30. Mrs. Higgins, a daily charwoman from the village, who came in twice weekly during holidays to sweep the sanatorium corridors, had entered the third-floor sick-bay carrying her galvanized pail and mop. She had pushed open the door of the matron's private sitting-room, expecting to find the hearth cleaned and the kettle boiling on the spirit stove. Instead, she had dropped her pail with a clattering crash that echoed through the empty wing, and had fled screaming across the paved courtyard to the schoolhouse. Miss Hartley and Dorothy Pierce, having heard the commotion from the West Wing, arrived at the sanatorium within minutes, where they were joined by Miss Harbottle, the headmistress, a tall, formidable woman of 58, with iron-gray hair rolled into an immaculate pompadour, gold pince-nez perched upon a severe nose, and a manner constructed to withstand any crisis short of an armed invasion. The scene in the matron's room was one of chilling domestic stillness. Miss Edna Rook, who had presided over the health and physical discipline of Haverstock for 14 years with a rod of unbending iron, sat upright in a high-backed wing armchair beside the cold fireplace. She was dressed in her customary uniform of stiffly starched navy serge, her white apron spotless, her chatelaine of brass keys pinned to her waistband. Her head had fallen slightly to the right, resting against the floral chintz of the chairback. Her eyes were half closed, her features relaxed into a mask of deep, unnatural slumber, and her skin possessed the pale, waxy translucence of death. Upon the low tea-table at her right hand stood a silver teapot, a jug of cold milk, and 2 matching bone china cups. One cup had been drained, a thin ring of dried brown sediment coating the porcelain. The second cup remained completely full, cold tea scummed over with milk skin, untouched. Dr. Ransom, the local physician who had been summoned by telephone from Chipping Campden, arrived 20 minutes later. His examination was brief, grim, and decisive. "She has been dead for at least 8 hours, Dr. Ransom announced, stepping back from the chair and covering the matron's face with a linen towel. "Death occurred between 10 o'clock last night and 2 this morning. There are no marks of physical violence whatsoever. No struggle, no trauma. But look at the pupils contracted to pinpoints, and note the distinct faint odor of bitter almonds and chloral lingering on the rim of that empty teacup. It is a massive overdose of a barbiturate hypnotic, most likely veronal, taken in hot tea." "Veronal?" Miss Harbottle gasped, her pince-nez slipping from her nose. "Merciful heavens, Dr. Ransom! Matron Rook was the most abstemious, disciplined woman in England. She never touched a sleeping draught in her life. She regarded even aspirin as a moral weakness. Are you suggesting she took her own life?" "I am stating the medical cause of death, Miss Harbottle," Dr. Ransom replied stiffly. "Whether she took it knowingly, or whether it was administered to her by another hand, is a question for the police. But look at that second teacup on the tray. Edna Rook did not take tea alone in this room last night." Miss Hartley had not spoken. She stood quietly by the window, her hands folded in her woolen mittens, her keen blue eyes observing every detail of the chamber. She observed the coal scuttle neatly filled with Welsh cobbles, but with no ashes in the grate, indicating that the fire had been allowed to die out before the tea was served. She observed the pair of wet galoshes standing upon a sheet of newspaper behind the door, their rubber soles encrusted with damp red clay from the old orchard path. And then her gaze fell upon the floor beneath the matron's slippers. There, half hidden beneath the hem of the starched navy skirt, lay an ordinary school exercise book, bound in mottled blue paper, its cover embossed with the Haverstock crest. Resting upon the open book was a loose sheet of lined foolscap, covered from top to bottom in dense, sloping handwriting. 200 lines of identical punishment writing. "I will not leave the dormitory after lights out. I will not leave the dormitory after lights out." Miss Hartley looked at the signature, penned at the bottom of the page, in dark blue fountain pen ink. "Lydia Carnforth. Form upper V." Miss Hartley turned to Miss Harbottle, her voice dropping to a gentle, inquiring whisper. "Miss Harbottle, Lydia Carnforth is one of your pupils, is she not? Did you not mention on Wednesday that all the young ladies had departed for the half-term holiday on Monday morning?" Miss Harbottle stared at the paper on the floor, her severe face draining of all color. "Yes," the headmistress whispered, clutching the back of a chair. "Lydia Carnforth's luggage was collected by the railway carrier at 8 o'clock on Monday. She had a first-class ticket for Paddington, where her guardian was to meet her. She was seen boarding the coach at the school gates. There is not supposed to be a single pupil within 50 miles of this school. Chapter 2. The School and Its Silences. By 11 o'clock on Friday morning, Haverstock Ladies College had ceased to be an academic retreat, and had become the headquarters of a formal homicide investigation. Inspector Gault walked over to the tall bay window that looked out upon the terrace, where a stone sundial bore the chilling Latin motto, Hora volat, manet opus, the hour flies, the deed remains. He tugged at his mustache, his eyes narrowing, as he turned back to the three women seated before him. "Let us understand the domestic geography of this establishment, Miss Harbottle," Gault said, his voice ringing against the oak wainscoting. "During this vacation week, we have the headmistress in the east lodgings, Miss Pierce and her guest in the west wing, the deceased in the third-floor sanatorium, and Mr. Bramble in the cottage beside the north gates. That is 5 living souls occupying a building with 140 rooms, 4 separate staircases, and 3 miles of service corridors. A man with rubber-soled shoes could walk from the cellars to the bell tower at midnight and never be seen or heard by a living creature. Unless," Miss Hartley remarked gently, looking up from her wool, "he happened to pass a window where an elderly lady with a touch of insomnia was sitting with her chamomile tea. In St. Mary Mead, our dear Miss Hartnell has identified 3 distinct burglaries, 2 clandestine courtships, and a case of illicit pig slaughtering, simply because she has the habit of looking out at the parish church clock whenever she wakes in the night. The dark is never quite as empty as guilty people suppose." Inspector Gault of the Gloucestershire Constabulary had arrived from Cirencester in a black Wolseley saloon, accompanied by a police surgeon, a fingerprint sergeant, and Detective Constable Briggs. Gault was a brisk, practical officer of 45, with a military mustache, a keen sense of his own administrative importance, and a deep, instinctive distrust of anything that did not fit neatly into the standard police handbook of procedures. He walked with the heavy, measured tread of a man who believed that physical authority and a firm notebook were sufficient to untie any knot of human deceit, entirely unaware that the most dangerous secrets of an ancient school are not whispered in courtyards, but buried beneath 50 years of polite domestic routine and the rigid silence of institutional pride. "A locked school mystery, Miss Harbottle," Inspector Gault declared, pacing the floor of the headmistress's study, where a coal fire crackled in the hearth. "On the face of it, the situation is straightforward. We have an isolated country building, 4 adults on the premises, and a deceased matron poisoned in her sitting room. The front gates are padlocked at 7 every evening, the perimeter wall is 8 feet high and topped with stone coping, and the only keys to the exterior doors are held by yourself, the deceased, and Mr. Bramble, the groundskeeper." "I assure you, Inspector," Miss Harbottle said, her voice shaking with controlled outrage, "none of my staff could conceivably be capable of such an atrocity. Miss Pierce is an invalid recovering from illness. Mrs. Higgins is a devout Methodist whose family has lived in Chipping Campden for 4 generations. And Mr. Bramble, though somewhat rough in his manners, has served the school faithfully as gardener and boilerman for 22 years. "Quite so, Gault said smoothly, making a notation in his black leather book. "And yet people do not drop 10 grains of medicinal veronal into their own teacups by accident. Now, let us consider this exercise paper found beneath the body. You tell me this girl, Lydia Carnforth, is 17 years of age, a ward in Chancery under the guardianship of a Mr. Clement Weston of Mayfair." "That is correct," Miss Harbottle replied, adjusting her pince-nez. "Lydia was placed in our care 3 years ago, following the tragic death of her parents in a motor accident in France. Her father was Colonel Carnforth of the Indian Army, a gentleman of substantial fortune. Weston was her father's business associate and executor, and was appointed her sole legal guardian until she attains her majority at the age of 21. "And what kind of girl is she?" Inspector Gault asked. "A troublemaker? A rebel?" "Miss Dorothy Pierce, who sat beside Miss Hartley on the sofa, spoke up with quiet passion. "Lydia is an extraordinarily gifted girl, Inspector. Highly intelligent, artistic, but exceedingly private and deeply sensitive. These past 6 months, however, she has been in a state of profound, silent distress. She grew thin, she stopped eating in the refectory, and she spent hours alone in the old art room in the Elizabethan wing, sketching out of doors in all weathers. When I tried to comfort her, she would only say that a terrible trap was closing around her, and that when she left Haverstock, she would have no life of her own left to live." "Did she explain what she meant by a trap?" Miss Hartley asked softly, looking at Dorothy with her mild, sympathetic eyes. "No," Dorothy sighed. "She would say nothing more. But 2 weeks ago, Mr. Clement Weston himself came down to the school in his Rolls-Royce. He spent an hour closeted with Miss Harbottle, and then had a private interview with Lydia in the library. When Lydia came out of that room, her face was white as marble, and her hands were trembling so violently that she could scarcely hold her Latin primer." Miss Harbottle cleared her throat uncomfortably, shifting her gaze toward the window. "Mr. Weston came to discuss Lydia's future, Miss Pierce. He informed me that upon the completion of this school term at Christmas, Lydia would not be returning to Haverstock. A most advantageous marriage had been arranged for her with a wealthy foreign associate of Mr. Weston's, a gentleman from South America whose financial syndicate was engaged in extensive mining operations with Mr. Weston's firm in London. Weston explained that the marriage was of the utmost commercial importance to both families, and that Lydia's presence in London was urgently required." "And did Lydia agree to this marriage?" Miss Hartley inquired gently. She was not consulted in the matter," Miss Harbottle admitted with a defensive stiffening of her spine. "Mr. Weston is her legal guardian. Under the terms of Colonel Carnforth's will, he possesses absolute authority over her residence, her education, and her matrimonial settlements until she reaches 21. He was exceedingly firm on the point. He stated that Lydia was a foolish, romantic child who had developed nonsensical notions of attending university, and that he would brook no defiance whatsoever." "And the matron?" Miss Hartley asked. "How did Matron Rook regard the matter?" Miss Harbottle frowned. Edna Rook was a woman of rigid discipline. She believed that obedience was the supreme Christian virtue. 2 weeks ago, she caught Lydia attempting to leave the school grounds after dusk to post a letter in the village pillar box, a letter addressed, I believe, to a firm of solicitors in London. Matron confiscated the letter, handed it directly to Mr. Weston, and sentenced Lydia to 200 lines of detention punishment every evening after prep. "Ah," Miss Hartley breathed, her blue eyes narrowing in deep reflection. "The 200 lines on the foolscap sheet. I will not leave the dormitory after lights out." "Precisely," Gault said, nodding. "The paper was a standard punishment task, but how did it come to be under the matron's chair last night, when the girl was supposed to be in London?" "That," Miss Hartley said very softly, "is the central question of this house. For if Lydia Carnforth never reached London, if she slipped away from the motor coach and hid herself within these 200 acres of empty rooms, then Matron Rook discovered her hiding place, and the person who sat in that second chair and drank tea with the matron was someone who came to ensure that the secret remained hidden forever." Chapter 3. Inspector Gault's Theory. By Friday afternoon, Inspector Gault had developed a comprehensive and thoroughly conventional theory of the crime. Having interrogated Mrs. Higgins, the daily charwoman, and having inspected the school's dispensary in the sanatorium basement, Gault summoned Miss Hartley, Dorothy Pierce, and Miss Harbottle to the matron's office to outline his conclusions. "The case, ladies," Gault declared, standing before the cold hearth with his hands clasped behind his back, "is one of domestic theft leading to a fatal miscalculation. We have examined the locked poison press in the basement dispensary. The brass lock shows clear marks of having been forced with a heavy screwdriver or chisel. A 12-ounce bottle of medicinal veronal crystals, used by the school medical officer for compounding sedatives during the influenza outbreak 2 years ago, is missing from the third shelf. "And who had access to tools, Inspector?" Miss Harbottle asked anxiously. "Mr. Bramble, the groundskeeper," Gault replied with heavy satisfaction. "We have examined Mr. Bramble's workshop in the potting sheds. We found a 3/4-inch cabinet chisel with fresh scratches upon its cutting edge that matched the brass burrs on the dispensary lock. Furthermore, we have discovered that Mr. Bramble had a serious grievance against the deceased. 3 weeks ago, Matron Rook reported Bramble to the governors for smelling of spirits on duty, resulting in the stoppage of 2 weeks' wages." "Mr. Bramble may be rough, Inspector," Dorothy Pierce protested, "but he is not a murderer. He has worked here for 20 years. A man whose wages are stopped, Miss Pierce, and who is threatened with the loss of his cottage and his pension, is a man with a desperate motive," Gault countered firmly. "Our reconstruction is clear. Bramble broke into the dispensary on Thursday evening to steal the veronal, intending to dose the matron's evening tea to render her unconscious so that he could search her office for his disciplinary file. He miscalculated the dosage. He used 1/2 ounce instead of 5 grains, and killed her where she sat." "And the second teacup?" Miss Hartley asked, her voice mild as clover honey. "If Mr. Bramble entered the room as a burglar with a chisel in his hand, did the matron invite him to sit in her best armchair, pour him a cup of hot tea from her silver pot, and add milk and sugar before he poisoned her?" Inspector Gault's face flushed a deep, uncomfortable crimson. He cleared his throat and adjusted his tunic belt. "The second teacup, Miss Hartley, was undoubtedly placed there by Bramble himself, to create the illusion that the matron had entertained a social guest, thereby diverting suspicion from a common servant to a person of quality. A very sophisticated piece of theatrical staging for a gardener who smells of spirits," Miss Hartley remarked, with a gentle smile. "And what of the wet galoshes behind the door, encrusted with the red clay of the orchard path? Does Mr. Bramble wear ladies' size 5 galoshes with brass buckles?" Gault blinked, his brow furrowing in irritation. "The galoshes belonged to Matron Rook, of course." "Indeed," Miss Hartley said softly, "which proves that Matron Rook herself walked down the orchard path in the rain, late yesterday afternoon, before she sat down to take tea. And why would a strict matron walk into the dripping orchard in the dusk, during half-term, unless she had seen something, or someone, moving among the apple trees?" The basement dispensary was a subterranean vault of vaulted brickwork, smelling intensely of sweet spirit of nitre, tincture of benzoin, carbolic soap, and dry poppy heads. Rows of dark amber glass bottles, their labels lettered in gilt Latin capitals, lined the pine shelves behind wire mesh grills. In the center of the room, on a slate-topped dispensing bench, stood a set of delicate brass apothecary scales under a glass bell jar, surrounded by pestles of white Wedgwood china and stacks of filter paper. Miss Hartley approached the forced poison cabinet in the corner. Under her magnifying glass, the wooden door frame told a very specific story. The brass lock plate had indeed been forced from its mortise, but the chisel marks upon the pine wood were curiously light, hesitation strokes rather than the clean, powerful levering of an experienced carpenter. "Look closely here, Inspector," Miss Hartley whispered, pointing her gloved finger at the wood. "A strong man like Mr. Bramble, whose arms are accustomed to felling timber and digging heavy Cotswold clay, would have levered this hasp in a single stroke, splintering the frame clean across the grain. But these small, tentative scratches were made by someone with slender hands, someone unaccustomed to manual tools, who had to strike the chisel 3 times with the heel of a heavy shoe before the screw gave way." Miss Hartley walked over to the matron's large oak writing desk that stood between the 2 tall, mullioned windows. The desk was an imposing piece of Victorian furniture, fitted with 8 side drawers and a broad central knee-hole. The top of the desk was arranged with mathematical precision. A green leather blotter without a single ink spot, a brass inkstand with 2 glass wells containing black and red ink, a ruler, an ebony paper knife, and a neat stack of blank term report cards tied with red tape. Every single drawer on the right-hand and left-hand pedestals stood unlocked, their wooden poles sliding easily at the touch, except for one. The top right-hand drawer, the shallow drawer directly beneath the desktop, was securely locked. The key was not in the keyhole, nor was it among the bunch of brass keys hanging from the dead woman's chatelaine. Miss Hartley rested her gloved fingertips upon the brass escutcheon of the locked drawer. "Inspector Gault," Miss Hartley said with quiet authority, "a woman who keeps her writing desk in such exquisite order does not leave 7 drawers open and lock only one, unless that single drawer contains something of immense, immediate importance that she could not permit anyone else to see. If you wish to understand who killed Edna Rook, you must open this drawer." Chapter 4. The Locked Drawer. Inspector Gault, having satisfied himself that none of the keys on the deceased matron's chatelaine would turn the small brass cylinder of the locked desk drawer, stood back with an expression of baffled impatience. "Briggs," Gault said to the constable, "go down to the police car and bring up the heavy crowbar. We'll have to force the woodwork." "Oh, please, Inspector," Miss Hartley intervened, with a gentle, pained flutter of her hands. "Such a beautiful piece of mid-Victorian mahogany. It would be an absolute tragedy to split the dovetailing. If you will permit an old woman who has opened many a jammed workbox in her time." From her reticule, Miss Hartley extracted her faithful, silver-plated steel hairpin. Stepping up to the desk with the delicate precision of a surgeon, she inserted the curved wire into the keyhole. With 2 gentle, probing turns, and a slight upward pressure against the brass tumblers, a clean, distinct click echoed through the silent room. The drawer slid smoothly open. Inside, resting upon a sheet of clean blotting paper, lay 3 distinct items. The first was a small, engraved gentleman's visiting card, printed in formal copperplate. "Mr. Philip Ashby, solicitor and legal advisor, Lincoln's Inn Fields, London." Penciled across the back of the card in a sharp, urgent hand was a single date and time. Thursday, 23rd October, 6:30 p.m. The second item was a heavy brass key, stamped with the number 14. The duplicate key to the old, disused art studio situated in the far corner of the Elizabethan Manor wing. The third item was a stack of 3 school exercise books, bound in mottled blue card, each bearing the printed crest of Haverstock Ladies College. Across the front cover of each book was written in neat sloping script, "Lydia Carnforth, Detention Lines." Miss Hartley lifted the exercise books with infinite care, laying them upon the green blotter. She opened the topmost book. The pages were dense with 200 repetitions of the standard school punishment formula, written in dark blue fountain pen ink. "I will not leave the dormitory after lights out. I will not leave the dormitory after lights out. I will not leave the dormitory after lights out." Page after page, line after line, the mechanical punishment marched across the ruled paper in tight, disciplined rows. To an untrained eye, it was the very picture of tedious, resentful schoolgirl compliance, the dull labor of a rebellious pupil working off 50 hours of disciplinary detention. Inspector Gault glanced at the pages with a dismissive grunt. Just school punishment lines. The matron locked them up to verify the count before the girl went home. Nothing of evidentiary value there. "Do you think so, Inspector?" Miss Hartley murmured, tilting her head as she adjusted her lace inspection magnifying glass. In St. Mary Mead, when young Tommy Simons was made to write 50 lines by the schoolmaster for putting a frog in the inkwell, his writing grew larger, sloppier, and more erratic with every single line, because a hand tires very quickly of mechanical repetition. And young Fred Perkins deliberately altered his final lines to see if anyone was reading what he wrote. When a person is forced to write the same sentence 100 times, the mind inevitably rebels against the tyranny of the pen. But look at these lines, Inspector. The writing does not grow careless. It remains extraordinarily tight, disciplined, and controlled. And look at the spacing between the lines. Every 20th line is indented by a fraction of an inch, as though the writer were following an exact, calculated rhythm. Lydia did not alter these lines out of childish petulance. She understood that Matron Rook, with her mechanical passion for order, would count the lines to ensure there were 200, but would never read the actual words. It is the brilliant subterfuge of an intelligent mind that knows its oppressor's blind spots. Miss Hartley turned to the second book, then to the third. "Why?" Miss Hartley whispered, her mild blue eyes gleaming with an intense quiet concentration. "Would a terrified girl write 600 lines of detention punishment during the dead of night in an empty school? And why would Matron Rook lock those exercise books in her private desk drawer, alongside Mr. Philip Ashby's visiting card?" "Because," Dorothy Pierce said, stepping forward with trembling hands, Matron knew that Lydia had never gone to London. Lydia was hiding here in the school, and these books were found in her hiding place. "Yes," Miss Hartley agreed softly. "Matron found the girl yesterday afternoon. She brought these books back to her office. She placed Mr. Ashby's card beside them, and then she sat down in her armchair to wait for her visitor. But the question we must ask ourselves, Inspector, is not who made the tea. It is what was written inside these lines that made it necessary for Edna Rook to die before morning." Chapter 5. Mr. Bramble's Afternoon. While Miss Hartley remained in the matron's office studying the exercise books, Inspector Gault proceeded to execute his planned arrest of Mr. Bramble. Accompanied by Constable Briggs, Gault marched down through the kitchen gardens to the ancient stone potting sheds that stood behind the boiler house. There, amidst rows of terracotta flower pots, bags of bone meal, and bundles of garden canes, they found Mr. Bramble sitting upon an upturned wheelbarrow, smoking a short clay pipe and cleaning a spade. Bramble was a burly, weathered man of 55, with dirt-ingrained hands, shaggy gray eyebrows, and the perpetual squint of someone who spent his life outdoors. "Now then, Bramble," Inspector Gault announced, standing in the doorway with his hands on his tunic belt. "You'll come along with us to the schoolhouse. We found the chisel you used on the dispensary lock, and we know about your grudge against Matron Rook." Bramble took the clay pipe from his mouth, his weathered face twitching with a mixture of raw terror and stubborn defiance. He looked at Gault, then at the constable, and dropped his spade with a loud clang against the stone floor. "You've got no right, Inspector," Bramble stammered, his voice hoarse and shaking. "I never touched Matron Rook. I never poisoned nobody's tea. I'm an honest working man." "Then explain why you were seen lurking around the Elizabethan wing at 9 o'clock last night," Gault demanded. "And explain why your cabinet chisel has brass burrs on the blade that match the forced lock on the Veronal press." Bramble's hands began to shake violently. He looked down at his dirt-stained boots, his breath coming in ragged, wheezing gasps. I used the chisel on the coal hatch, Inspector. The iron bolt was rusted solid with the damp, and I had to lever it open." "And why were you opening the coal hatch in the middle of the night during half-term?" Bramble buried his face in his rough hands. Because of my brother George," he muttered brokenly. Miss Hartley, who had quietly walked down through the garden path accompanied by Dorothy Pierce, arrived at the potting shed door just as Bramble spoke. "Your brother George, Mr. Bramble?" Miss Hartley asked in her gentlest, most soothing tone. "Is that George Bramble who was formerly the carter at the mill in Chipping Campden?" Bramble looked up at Miss Hartley, tears cutting pale furrows through the garden dirt on his cheeks. "Aye, ma'am. George lost his wife to the fever in August, and then the mill closed down, and the bailiffs turned him out of his cottage on Michaelmas Day. He had nowhere to go, no bread to eat, and his chest is fair ruined with the asthma. I couldn't leave my own flesh and blood to die in a ditch on the Cotswolds. So I brought him here on Monday night, after the school coaches left. I put him in the old boiler cellar beneath the Elizabethan wing, where it's dry and warm near the flues. I've been taking him bread and cold meat from the larder every evening." Inspector Gault stared at the gardener in disbelief. "Are you telling me you've had a trespasser living in the school cellar for 4 days?" "Come and see for yourself, Inspector," Bramble pleaded, rising to his feet. "George is down there right now. He's coughing fit to burst. But as God is my witness, neither of us ever went near the sanatorium, and we never touched a grain of poison." 10 minutes later, the inspection of the boiler cellar confirmed every word of Bramble's confession. Huddled upon a pile of dry sacking beside the warm brickwork of the furnace was George Bramble, an emaciated, gray-haired man of 60, shivering with chronic bronchial asthma, surrounded by half a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheddar cheese, and an empty water bottle. George Bramble could scarcely sit upright without coughing, let alone climb 3 flights of stairs to the sanatorium to brew poisoned tea for a school matron. Inspector Gault stood in the damp cellar, his face a picture of profound official chagrin. "So," Miss Hartley remarked softly as they climbed back into the courtyard, "Mr. Bramble's secret was entirely innocent, born of brotherly affection rather than malice. It is so very common in St. Mary Mead. Whenever people are seen moving about in the dark with guilty faces, everyone assumes they have committed a murder, when in reality they are merely hiding an unlicensed dog, or poaching a rabbit for an ailing sister. The obvious suspect is almost never the true culprit, Inspector, because a real murderer takes immense care to appear completely blameless." Chapter 6. The Complication. At 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, the quiet quadrangle of Haverstock was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek, dark blue Humber Pullman saloon car. The car drew up before the main entrance of the schoolhouse, its polished chrome glinting through the autumn mist. The driver's door opened, and a gentleman of approximately 42 stepped out onto the gravel. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal gray overcoat with a velvet collar, a soft Homburg hat, and polished oxblood leather shoes. He possessed the sleek, composed handsomeness of a successful London barrister. Wavy dark hair, touched with silver at the temples, sharp, intelligent hazel eyes, and a warm, authoritative smile that seemed designed to inspire instant confidence in anxious clients. It was Mr. Philip Ashby. "Good afternoon, ladies," Ashby said, removing his hat with an elegant, deferential bow, as Miss Harbottle, Miss Hartley, and Dorothy Pierce met him in the entrance hall. "I received Miss Harbottle's urgent telephone message in London this morning concerning the dreadful tragedy of poor Matron Rook. As legal adviser to Mr. Clement Weston and the Carnforth estate, I felt it my immediate duty to drive down and offer every possible assistance to the school in this distressing crisis." "You are exceedingly kind, Mr. Ashby," Miss Harbottle said, visibly relieved by the arrival of a sophisticated London professional. "The police are currently searching the grounds, but the situation is utterly bewildering." "A terrible shock," Ashby murmured, his voice rich with cultured sympathy. "Edna Rook was a faithful servant of the institution. Mr. Weston was profoundly grieved when I informed him of the news before leaving London. He asked me to convey his deepest condolences and to inquire whether there had been any communication or development regarding our dear ward, Lydia." "Lydia has not been found, Mr. Ashby," Dorothy Pierce said, her voice cool and guarded, "though we know she never reached London." Ashby's eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, a minute, almost imperceptible contraction of his pupils that did not escape Miss Hartley's watchful gaze. "A tragic, headstrong girl," Ashby sighed, shaking his head with an expression of pained benevolence. "Her poor father's death affected her mind more deeply than any of us realized. Mr. Weston has been beside himself with worry. We have private enquiry agents searching the railway terminals in London. But we feared she might have attempted to return here. Has anything of hers been found? Only some detention lines in the matron's office, Miss Harbottle replied. Detention lines? Ashby said, his smile remaining perfectly fixed, though his fingers tightened slightly upon the brim of his Homburg hat. Ah, mere schoolroom scraps, no doubt. Poor child. If the police have no objection, I should like to inspect the girl's dormitory room to see if she took her warm winter clothing. One must do everything possible to ensure her safety. Inspector Gault is currently in the library, Mr. Ashby, Miss Harbottle said, leading him toward the inner corridor. I will introduce you immediately. Mr. Philip Ashby removed his pigskin driving gloves with slow, theatrical deliberation, revealing long manicured fingers that bore an antique gold signet ring engraved with a crest. His voice, when he spoke, possessed the effortless soothing modulation of a man who had spent 20 years persuading chancery judges and nervous heiresses that his advice was as sound as the Bank of England. My dear Miss Harbottle, Ashby said, accepting a glass of dry sherry in the library, we must not allow our natural grief for poor Miss Rook to cloud our practical judgment. The law moves with strict, dispassionate rules. If the unfortunate woman took an accidental overdose of her own sleeping medicine, it is an administrative tragedy for the school. But we must be exceedingly careful not to create a public scandal that would permanently damage Haverstock's reputation in the eyes of the parents. Think of the governors. Miss Hartley observed him over the rim of her spectacles. She noticed that while his lips were curved in an expression of sympathetic benevolence, his right foot was tapping a rapid, silent staccato against the Persian hearthrug, the unmistakable, involuntary tension of a gambler whose last chip was on the table. As Ashby followed the headmistress down the hall, Miss Hartley and Dorothy Pierce returned to Dorothy's sitting room in the West Wing. As Dorothy pushed open her door, she uttered a sharp gasp and stopped dead upon the threshold. Lying upon the carpet in the center of the room, directly beneath the brass letter slit in the oak door, was a single folded sheet of cheap, unwatermarked typing paper. Dorothy knelt down and picked it up with trembling fingers. Pasted upon the paper were words cut out from the headlines of a morning newspaper, forming a stark, threatening message. Leave the Carnforth matter alone. Forget the exercise books if you value your position and your life. Edna Rook would not be warned. Dorothy clutched her throat, her face draining of all color. Miss Hartley, look, a threat. Someone was in this corridor while we were at the potting shed. Miss Hartley took the paper and examined it closely. Notice, Dorothy, Miss Hartley said, her voice remaining perfectly calm, though her blue eyes shone with formidable resolve. The paper was slipped under your door within the last 40 minutes. The gum on the cut-out letters is still damp at the edges. Whoever pasted this message together is here in this building right now. He did not come to help the school, my dear. He came because he knows that those exercise books contain the key to his destruction, and he is terrified that we will read them before he can burn them. Chapter 7. The Pattern in the Lines. While Inspector Gault was engaged in escorting Mr. Philip Ashby through the dormitory corridors in the main quadrangle, Miss Hartley sat at the small walnut writing table in Dorothy Pierce's sitting room, the 3 mottled blue exercise books laid out before her. Outside, the autumn twilight was deepening into a cold, purple dark, and the rain had begun to tap against the leaded panes like the fingers of an importunate ghost. With her lace inspection magnifying glass held steadily in her right hand and a sharpened pencil in her left, Miss Hartley began a systematic, line-by-line examination of the 200 lines of punishment writing contained in the first exercise book. The formula was written 10 times per page across 20 ruled leaves. I will not leave the dormitory after lights out. To anyone scanning the page casually, it appeared as an unbroken sea of identical blue calligraphy. But, under Miss Hartley's 10-power lens, the subtle anomalies in the text began to leap from the paper with startling, deliberate clarity. On the second page, at line 20, the formula did not read, "I will not leave the dormitory after lights out." It read, "I will not leave the haven after lights out." On page 4, at line 40, the 16th word had been altered, "I will not leave the dormitory after evening." On page 6, at line 60, "I will not leave the lodge after lights out." On page 8, at line 80, "I will not leave the dormitory after passing." On page 10, at line 100, "I will not leave the manor after lights out." On page 12, at line 120, "I will not leave the dormitory after autumn." On page 14, at line 140, "I will not leave the studio after lights out." On page 16, at line 160, "I will not leave the dormitory after twilight." On page 18, at line 180, "I will not leave the east wing after lights out." And on page 20, at line 200, the final line concluded, "I will not leave the dormitory after rescue." Miss Hartley took a sheet of Dorothy's notepaper and wrote down the 10 substituted words in their strict numerical sequence: haven, evening, lodge, passing, manor, autumn, studio, twilight, east wing, and rescue. Miss Hartley drew a red pencil circle around the first capital letter of each substituted word, reading them out in sequence: HELPMASTER, spelling out the urgent words, "Help, Master." Dorothy Pierce, who was leaning over Miss Hartley's shoulder, let out a soft, trembling gasp of wonder. "Miss Hartley, it spells a message, 'Help, Master.'" She was calling to the teaching staff, to anyone who checked her detention book. "Yes," Miss Hartley said, her voice filled with deep, admiring reverence for the young girl's courage and resourcefulness. A brilliant, desperate cry for help, disguised as mechanical obedience. But look further, Dorothy. Look at the words themselves: haven, lodge, manor, studio, east wing. Each word is a landmark in her journey across this house, a map of her flight, recorded in the very exercise books that were meant to enforce her submission. She was not merely writing a message for the future. She was preserving the landmarks of her own survival in the only language that could not be taken from her. Miss Hartley turned to the second exercise book. Here the young girl had utilized a different, even more subtle method of encoding. Across 30 pages of identical lines, every 13th line was written with a slightly broader downstroke on the letter T, as though the pen nib had been pressed firmly against the paper. When Miss Hartley aligned the pages against the candlelight, the darkened letters T formed an undulating diagonal line that spelled out the name of her legal tormentor. Ashby took the bonds. "Consider the psychological endurance required for this, Dorothy," Miss Hartley murmured, her eyes shining with tears of profound empathy. A girl of 17, imprisoned by fear in a cold, empty garret, knowing that her guardian was plotting to sell her into a foreign marriage to cover his own embezzlement. She had no money, no allies, and no way to reach the outside world. And yet instead of sinking into despair, she sat by the gray light of a dormer window, using her punishment exercise books to record the evidence that would one day bring justice to her father's memory. It is a spirit worthy of the ancient martyrs. Miss Hartley turned to the third exercise book. There, between lines 80 and 100, the margin was pierced with tiny pinprick indentations, arranged in vertical pairs. When held up to the warm candlelight of the hearth, the pinpricks formed a clear, concise cipher, spelling out the exact nature of the crime. Weston stole my trust, forcing marriage to cover theft, hiding in old art room. Miss Hartley laid down the exercise book and leaned back in her chair, her hands resting quietly in her lap. "In St. Mary Mead," Miss Hartley said softly, "when young Kara Wright was locked in her bedchamber by her tyrannical uncle, who wished to seize her post-office savings, she embroidered a message into the hem of the parlor tea cozy, using red cross-stitch upon a crimson background, so that only someone looking for the truth would ever see it. Wicked men always assume that young women are helpless, foolish creatures who will submit quietly to cruelty. They forget that intelligence, when driven into a corner by injustice, is capable of the most extraordinary quiet courage. She looked at Dorothy. Edna Rook discovered this book on Thursday afternoon. She read these lines. She took the duplicate brass key to the old art studio from her keyboard. She walked down the orchard path in her galoshes, and she found Lydia. But Matron Rook was an obstinate, unimaginative woman who believed in legal authority above all else. Instead of calling the police, she telephoned Mr. Clement Weston's London office to demand an explanation. And Mr. Weston did not send an explanation. He sent his executioner. Chapter 8. The Ward of Weston. The full, monstrous architecture of the conspiracy became clear, as Miss Hartley and Dorothy Pierce pieced together the financial history of the Carnforth Trust. Colonel Carnforth had died in 1949, leaving an estate valued at £84,000 in British government bonds, Indian Railway shares, and prime London real estate, held in trust for his only child, Lydia, until her 21st birthday. Mr. Clement Weston, as sole managing trustee, had been granted complete discretionary control over the portfolio. Beginning in 1950, Weston had embarked upon a series of disastrous, highly speculative mining ventures in the Brazilian hinterland, using Colonel Carnforth's trust securities as collateral for immense commercial loans from a South American merchant syndicate headed by a ruthless financier named Valdez. By the summer of 1952, the Brazilian mining syndicate had collapsed into total bankruptcy. Over £50,000 of Lydia Carnforth's inheritance had been utterly wiped out. Under English trust law, when Lydia attained the age of 18 in December of that year, she possessed the statutory right to demand an independent audit of the estate by the Chancery Court. Such an audit would have resulted in the immediate exposure of Weston's embezzlement, the seizure of his personal assets, and a sentence of 14 years penal servitude at the Old Bailey. Weston had conceived a desperate, diabolical escape from his ruin. Valdez, the South American syndicate leader, had agreed to cancel Weston's £50,000 debt and sign a full release of all claims against the Carnforth estate, on one single condition: that Weston deliver Lydia Carnforth to him as his lawful wife before the end of the year, carrying with her the remaining £30,000 of unencumbered colonial real estate. Once married to Valdez and taken to South America, Lydia's legal identity would be merged into her husband's under foreign matrimonial law. The Chancery audit would be permanently blocked, and Weston's theft would remain buried forever. The legal position of an orphaned ward in Chancery, Dorothy, Miss Hartley explained, her voice carrying the precise, practical knowledge of an elderly lady who had spent 50 years listening to family solicitors, is one of the most delicate and perilous situations in our entire legal system. When a father appoints a sole trustee with absolute discretionary powers over the estate, the court assumes that the gentleman in question is a person of immaculate honor. But if that gentleman is a reckless speculator who treats trust funds as his own private purse, the ward has no independent voice until she attains her legal majority. Until she is 18, she cannot instruct a solicitor in her own name. She cannot inspect the bank passbooks. She cannot even refuse to reside where her guardian commands. She is entirely in his power, and if her guardian is determined to destroy her to save himself, she has no protection under heaven except her own wits. The architect of this fraudulent trust assignment was Mr. Philip Ashby. As Weston's confidential solicitor, Ashby had drafted the bogus settlement papers, had forged the trustee authorizations, and stood to receive a fee of £5,000 upon the successful completion of the foreign marriage. Lydia, having overheard a private conversation between Weston and Ashby in the Mayfair Library during the summer holidays, had realized the horrifying fate being prepared for her. When she arrived at Haverstock in September, she had attempted to write to independent solicitors in London, but her letters had been intercepted by the strict, rule-bound Matron Rook and handed directly to her guardian. On Monday morning, when the school motor coaches departed for the half-term holiday, Lydia had staged her desperate escape. She had carried her small traveling valise to the school gates, had allowed the luggage carrier to take it, and then, while the mist was thick upon the driveway, had slipped behind the laurel bushes. She had crept back into the empty school, making her way through the disused Elizabethan service corridors to the abandoned art studio on the top floor of the West Wing, a vast, dusty garret filled with Victorian plaster casts, broken easels, and forgotten furniture, where no one had set foot since 1940. There, with 3 tins of biscuits, a jar of marmalade, and a pitcher of water drawn from the sanatorium tap in the dead of night, Lydia had hidden herself, writing her coded cry for help in her detention books, waiting for someone to find her before her guardian's agents could track her down. "And Matron found her," Dorothy Pierce whispered, tears of horror streaming down her face. "Matron found her on Thursday afternoon." "Yes," Miss Hartley said, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. "And when Matron telephoned Lincoln's Inn Fields, she spoke to Philip Ashby." Ashby realized that as Edna Rook spoke to the school governors, the entire conspiracy would collapse in an hour. He drove down from London in his Humber saloon on Thursday evening. He arrived at 6:30, the very time penciled upon the back of his visiting card in the matron's drawer. He came to the sanatorium. He pretended to listen to her demands. He made a pot of tea, and while her back was turned, he dropped half an ounce of medicinal veronal from the dispensary into her cup. Miss Hartley rose from her chair, her knitting bag clutched firmly in her hands. "And now, Dorothy, Mr. Philip Ashby is here in this building, pretending to search for a missing pupil. He has not yet found the art studio, because he does not know the layout of the Elizabethan wing. But if he finds her before we do, he will not hesitate to ensure that Lydia Carnforth never speaks again." Chapter 9. A Message in the Margins. The rescue of Lydia Carnforth was executed with the quiet, urgent precision of a military operation. Miss Hartley and Dorothy Pierce, having secured the duplicate brass key number 14 from the matron's desk, hurried down the darkened corridors of the West Wing, avoiding the main hall where Inspector Gault was still taking statements from the daily staff. The Elizabethan wing was the oldest portion of Haverstock, a rambling, 4-story stone labyrinth of narrow passages, creaking oak floorboards, and heavy arched doorways dating from the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. The air was cold, smelling of ancient stone, damp plaster, and chimney soot. The passage through the Elizabethan wing was like walking backward through 2 centuries of neglected history. The floorboards, broad planks of unplaned English elm, warped by the damp of 300 winters, creaked with sharp gunshot cracks beneath their feet. On either side, arched doorways of carved oak opened into silent, dust-sheeted chambers where former dormitories lay under mounds of yellowing calico. A stuffed peacock, its plumage faded to dull gray, stood in a glass case beside a broken harpsichord whose rusted wires hummed faintly in the draught. In such an immense, forgotten attic, a fugitive could live for a month without ever being discovered by the casual glance of a cleaner. At the top of a winding spiral staircase of worn spiral granite, they reached a heavy oak door reinforced with hand-forged iron studs. A painted wooden label above the lintel read in faded Gothic lettering, "Studio Artis, the Old Art Studio." Miss Hartley inserted the brass key into the lock. It turned with a stiff, screeching protest that seemed to echo through the empty timbers of the roof. She pushed the door open. The room was vast, high-ceilinged, and filled with deep velvet shadows. Rain beat furiously against the tall, diamond-paned dormer windows that looked out over the dripping Cotswold parkland. Stacked along the walls were dusty plaster busts of Homer and Julius Caesar, piles of discarded drawing boards, broken wicker chairs, and several large theatrical screens covered in faded green baize. In the far corner, Beside an empty brick hearth, where a single woolen traveling rug was spread upon a pile of dry canvas sacks, sat a slender figure. Lydia Carnforth was huddled in her navy blue school blazer, her dark hair tangled around her pale, hollow-cheeked face, her large gray eyes wide with terror as the door swung open. In her trembling right hand she held a heavy iron palette knife, her knuckles white with strain. "Don't come near me," the girl cried out, her voice raw and cracking with sheer exhaustion. "I won't go with him. I'd rather throw myself from the tower into the courtyard than marry that man." "Lydia, my darling," Dorothy Pierce cried, running across the dusty floorboards and falling to her knees beside the girl. "It is Miss Pierce. You are safe, my dear. You are safe." The palette knife clattered from Lydia's hand. With a long, broken sob that seemed to tear through her entire body, the girl collapsed into Dorothy's arms, weeping with the uncontrollable, overwhelming relief of a hunted creature that has finally found sanctuary. Miss Hartley stepped forward. She wrapped her own warm woolen cape around the girl's shivering shoulders, and produced from her reticule a small silver flask of restorative lavender water. "Drink a few drops of this, my dear child," Miss Hartley said in her softest, most comforting voice. "You have been extraordinarily brave. Your message was read, your courage was understood, and no one will ever force you to leave this country against your will." Lydia looked up at Miss Hartley, her tear-stained face pale in the twilight. "The matron," Lydia whispered, clutching Dorothy's sleeve. "Matron Rook came here yesterday. She told me I had disgraced the school. She said she had telephoned Mr. Ashby, and that he was coming to take me away. She locked the door and took my exercise books. And then, late last night, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy, careful footsteps. Someone tried the lock with several keys. I hid behind the plaster statues. When the key wouldn't turn, the person went away. But I knew he would come back when it was dark." "Yes, my dear," Miss Hartley said grimly, looking toward the open doorway. "He has come back, but he will find that the law has arrived before him." Chapter 10. Mr. Ashby Explains. At 7 o'clock that evening, while the rain lashed the ancient mullions of Haverstock, and the wind moaned in the vast chimneys of the great hall, Miss Judith Hartley sat alone in the headmistress's inner library. A small fire of fragrant applewood crackled in the hearth, throwing long dancing shadows across the leather-bound folios of divinity and classical literature that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The door clicked open, and Mr. Philip Ashby stepped into the room. He had removed his heavy overcoat. Dressed in his impeccably tailored three-piece suit of dark charcoal wool, his gold watch chain gleaming across his waistcoat, he looked every inch the distinguished, unshakable London advocate. But under the yellow lamplight, his hazel eyes were restless, darting toward the corners of the room with sharp, predatory vigilance. "Ah, Miss Hartley," Ashby said smoothly, approaching the hearth with his hands outstretched toward the warmth. "Miss Harbottle informed me you wish to speak with me privately before Inspector Gault concludes his evening enquiries. I trust you are not too exhausted by this distressing day." "I am an old woman, Mr. Ashby," Miss Hartley replied gently, her knitting needles resting quietly in her lap. "And old women have a great tolerance for quiet evenings. But I have asked you to meet me here, because I believe that when a gentleman of your distinguished legal standing has reached the very end of his path, he is entitled to hear the truth laid out quietly, in a civilized room, before the handcuffs are placed upon his wrists." Ashby's hands froze over the hearth. A slow, mocking smile touched the corners of his mouth, though his eyes remained cold as winter ice. "Handcuffs, Miss Hartley?" he said, with an easy, dismissive chuckle. "I fear the excitement of the day has proved too much for your imagination. I am here purely in a professional capacity, representing the guardian of a missing pupil." "Ashby," Miss Hartley said softly, looking him directly in the eyes with her mild, unblinking gaze. "Because you poisoned Edna Rook with 10 grains of medicinal veronal in her sitting room last night between 8 and 9 o'clock. And because you returned to this school today to find Lydia Carnforth and destroy her exercise books before anyone could decode the message she had written inside them." The smile vanished from Ashby's face. The room fell into an immense suffocating silence, broken only by the sharp rhythmic crackle of the burning apple wood. Miss Hartley reached into her reticule and laid 3 objects upon the small walnut table beside her chair. The first was his own engraved visiting card, bearing the penciled notation, "Thursday, 23 October, 6:30 p.m. The second was the sheet of cut-out newspaper letters slipped under Dorothy Pierce's door 40 minutes earlier. The third was the 3rd exercise book, open to the decoded cipher. "Weston stole my trust, forcing marriage to cover theft." "We have found Lydia, Mr. Ashby," Miss Hartley continued, her voice remaining low, steady, and infinitely sorrowful. "She is at this moment in the West Wing, under the protection of Inspector Gault and 2 armed constables. She has told us everything. And when Inspector Gault telephoned the Chancery Court in London 20 minutes ago, the senior registrar confirmed that an emergency injunction has been granted, freezing all assets of the Carnforth Trust, and that a warrant has been issued for the immediate arrest of Mr. Clement Weston in Mayfair." Philip Ashby stood utterly motionless. The sophisticated veneer of the London barrister seemed to peel away from him like dry paint, leaving his features hollow, sharp, and stripped of every pretense. He sank down into the leather armchair opposite Miss Hartley, his hands trembling as he rested his elbows upon his knees. How did you read the lines?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and devoid of its cultured resonance. "Lydia is a very clever, very courageous girl. She substituted 1 word in every 20th line of her detention punishment. The first letters of those 10 words spelled out the words, 'Help, Master.' And in the margin of the 3rd book, she pricked out the truth with an ordinary sewing pin. A man who lives entirely in the world of legal documents and financial syndicates forgets that human beings under oppression will always find a way to make their voices heard." Ashby buried his face in his hands. A dry, shuddering laugh rattled in his chest. £120,000, Miss Hartley," Ashby murmured, his voice muffled by his fingers. "That was the total value of the Brazilian mining syndicate when Weston and I underwrote the debentures in 1950. We were supposed to double the money in 18 months. We had concessions from the government in Rio. We had geological reports certifying 60 miles of diamond-bearing gravel on the Rio das Mortes. It was the greatest financial venture of the decade." He lowered his hands, looking at Miss Hartley with eyes full of feverish, haunted desperation. "The concession was a fraud," Ashby said bitterly. "The river gravel was worthless silt. The promoters vanished into the Argentine with £70,000 of our capital. Weston had used £50,000 of Colonel Carnforth's trust securities to guarantee the bank credits. If the Chancery Court had audited the accounts when Lydia turned 18 in December, Weston and I would have been struck off the rolls, bankrupted, and sent to Dartmoor for 14 years. "So you arranged the marriage," Miss Hartley said. "It was the only way out," Ashby cried softly, clutching the arms of his chair. "Valdez had the power to ruin us with a stroke of his pen. But Valdez was infatuated with the idea of marrying an English officer's daughter of good family. He agreed to forgive the entire debt, to surrender the debentures, and to execute a full deed of indemnity, protecting Weston from all future claims. Lydia would have had an immense estate in Buenos Aires, carriages, servants, jewels, everything any girl could desire. Except her freedom," Miss Hartley said quietly. "Except her right to live her own life, and to keep the inheritance her father had earned for her with 30 years of service in India." "She was a child," Ashby spat, a flicker of vicious arrogance breaking through his despair. "A romantic, obstinate schoolgirl who knew nothing of the world. and then she vanished from the motor coach on Monday morning. Weston was frantic. We searched every railway station in London. And then, at 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon, my telephone rang. It was Edna Rook. Ashby shuddered, staring into the flames. "The matron was like a piece of granite," he whispered. "She told me she had found Lydia in the old art room. She told me she had read the detention books. She said, 'Mr. Ashby, I will not be an accomplice to fraud. If Mr. Weston does not come to this school by noon on Friday with a certified banker's statement proving that the trust is intact, I will lay the entire matter before the Bishop of Gloucester and the governors.' She was immovable. I begged her. I offered her £2,000 in cash. She looked at me over the telephone as if I were a common thief, and hung up the receiver." "So you took the Veronal," Miss Hartley said. "I drove down in the rain," Ashby said, speaking in a flat, mechanical whisper. "I arrived at 6:30. The sanatorium was dark. I had the old key to the outer service door, from when I handled the school's drainage lease 3 years ago. I went up to her room. She was sitting by the hearth, waiting for me. She had made the tea. She left the tray on the table while she went into her bedroom to fetch the exercise books. It took me 3 seconds. I had half an ounce of Veronal crystals in my waistcoat pocket, prescribed for my own insomnia 6 months ago. I tipped it into her cup, stirred it with the silver teaspoon, and sat down." He closed his eyes, his breath trembling. She came back with the books. She sat in the armchair. She drank the tea. Within 15 minutes, her speech began to slur. Within 20 minutes, she was asleep. I took the exercise books, but I couldn't find the key to the art studio on her keyboard. I searched the drawers, I searched the desk, but I couldn't find it. I heard a noise in the courtyard, Bramble walking past with his lantern, and I panicked. I locked the exercise books in the top desk drawer, slipped out through the side door, and drove back to London. He looked at Miss Hartley with hollow, dead eyes. And then this morning, Miss Harbottle telephoned to say the matron had been found dead, but that Lydia was still missing. I knew I had to come back. I had to get those books before the police forced the drawer. I pasted that note together in my car in the village, hoping to frighten Dorothy Pierce into silence. But it was too late. It was all too late from the very beginning. "You calculated everything, Mr. Ashby," Miss Hartley said softly, her voice filling the silent library like the tolling of a church bell. "You calculated the dosage of Veronal so that it would appear to be a heart failure or an accidental overdose. You calculated that the police would immediately suspect the rough gardener with the grievance over his wages. You calculated that without the exercise books, Lydia's story would be dismissed as the hysteria of an unruly child. You calculated every single legal and medical technicality except the one thing that clever, selfish men always fail to account for." Ashby lifted his haggard face, his bloodshot eyes staring at her. "And what was that, Miss Hartley?" "That a good, brave woman like Edna Rook, however strict and unimaginative she may have been, would not permit an innocent girl to be traded like a bale of merchandise to save a thief's skin," Miss Hartley replied, her voice ringing with absolute moral clarity. "And that when you tried to silence her. You left her lying with the very document that proved her innocence and your own guilt." Miss Hartley looked at the broken man before her with deep, quiet sorrow. "In St. Mary Mead," Miss Hartley said softly, "there was a brilliant young chemist named Arthur Bennett, who spent 10 years building a magnificent business in the High Street. But when he made a small speculation in Argentine rails that went wrong, he chose to forge his partner's signature on a promissory note rather than admit his error. He told himself it was only for a month. He told himself no one would be hurt. But within 2 years, he was standing in the dock at Winchester Assizes, facing 7 years' imprisonment. It is a terrible delusion, Mr. Ashby, to believe that a man can escape the consequences of his first dishonesty by committing a greater one. The path of deceit is a downward slope that always ends in the abyss." She rose from her chair, drawing her shawl around her shoulders. The heavy library door opened, and Inspector Gault stepped into the room, followed by Detective Constable Briggs, carrying a pair of steel handcuffs. Philip Ashby did not look up. He held out his wrists in silent, utter surrender, and allowed himself to be led away into the dark. Chapter 11. The Morning After. On Saturday morning, the Cotswold mists had vanished, leaving the parkland of Haverstock Ladies College bathed in the crisp, golden sunlight of late October. The air was clean, sharp, and fragrant with the scent of fallen leaves and wet cedar. In the sunlit sitting room of the West Wing, Miss Hartley sat on the sofa beside Lydia Carnforth, who was dressed in a warm woolen skirt and cardigan provided by Dorothy Pierce. The girl's face was still pale and fragile, but the haunted terror in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady peace. Miss Harbottle, looking humbled and chastened, entered the room carrying a silver tray with a pot of China tea and a plate of hot buttered scones. "I have just spoken by telephone with the official solicitor in London, Lydia, my dear," Miss Harbottle said, her voice softer and more human than it had ever been during term time. "Mr. Clement Weston was arrested at his residence in Mayfair at 8 o'clock this morning. The High Court of Chancery has assumed direct jurisdiction over your father's estate. Miss Dorothy Pierce has been formally appointed your legal guardian and trustee, and an emergency allowance has been granted to ensure that you may complete your studies and enter Somerville College next autumn to read English literature, precisely as your dear father wished." Lydia's eyes filled with tears of deep, overwhelming gratitude. She took Dorothy's hand, pressing it against her cheek, unable to speak for the fullness of her heart. Over breakfast in the sunny parlor, while the autumn thrushes sang in the dew-drenched yew hedges outside, Lydia Carnforth sat between Miss Hartley and Dorothy Pierce, holding a cup of steaming hot cocoa with both hands. "When I was hiding in that dark room behind the statues," Lydia said softly, her gray eyes reflecting the morning light, "I used to listen to the chapel clock striking the quarters through the night. Every stroke felt like the closing of an iron door. I thought that no one in the world would ever know what had happened to me, that I would be put onto a ship, taken across the sea, and forgotten forever. And then, when the door opened, and I saw Miss Hartley standing there, with her woolen shawl and her kind eyes, I knew that the world was not made of wicked men after all." Miss Hartley took the girl's small hand in hers, patting it with tender reassurance. "There is always more good in the world than evil, my dear child," Miss Hartley said gently. "The evil makes a great deal of noise, and builds immense legal documents, and buys motor cars, and tries to terrify everyone into submission. But the good is quiet, and patient, and endures, and in the end it is always the quiet things that outlast the storm." Miss Hartley smiled, her knitting needles clicking with serene, contented rhythm. "It is a very beautiful morning, Dorothy," Miss Hartley said softly, looking out through the tall leaded windows toward the golden beech trees that line the drive. "And it is a great comfort to know that in a world where there is so much selfishness and ambition, the quiet courage of an honest child and the patient endurance of truth can still prevail against the most powerful conspiracies." Constance Vane's carriage was waiting in the driveway to take Miss Hartley back to the railway station for her journey home to St. Mary Mead. As Miss Hartley gathered her reticule and her traveling rug, Lydia stepped forward and placed her arms around the elderly lady's neck, kissing her cheek with tender devotion. "I will never forget you, Miss Hartley," Lydia whispered. "You read what was in my heart when everyone else saw only lines of punishment. We must always look very closely at the small overlooked things, my dear," Miss Hartley replied with a gentle pat upon the girl's shoulder, "for it is in the small things that the truth always chooses to hide." And so the gates of Haverstock Ladies College closed behind a tragedy that had almost destroyed an innocent life, leaving the ancient stones to stand in peace once more beneath the quiet autumn skies. It is a case that makes one reflect upon the profound vulnerability of those who find themselves trapped by authority. and the extraordinary resourcefulness that can emerge from a frightened heart when all ordinary doors seem closed. I want to return to the question I asked you when we began our journey this evening. Have you ever seen someone who was forced to make themselves invisible, bearing an impossible burden in silence, until someone had the patience to see what was really there? Leave your reflections in the comments below. I read every single message, and the thoughts and experiences you share always add such deep meaning to these quiet midnight gatherings. If Midnight Pages is a place where you find solace, a quiet room where you can set aside the demands of the world and lose yourself in a tale of human character and classic mystery, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share tonight's story with someone who appreciates the art of careful storytelling. There are many more forgotten ledgers to open and more quiet hours waiting for us. This is David, wishing you a peaceful and restful night from Ohio. Whatever heavy silence you may be navigating tonight, may you find a voice that speaks for you, and may the morning bring you freedom.